Mr. President, there have been more than 9 million illegal alien border crossings on President Biden's watch. At the same time, there's been a 57% decrease in arrests of criminal illegal aliens and a 67% decrease in deportation of criminal aliens. This complete lack of enforcement of existing law has caused unimaginable human suffering across our country. One such tragedy occurred last month in Athens, Georgia. An illegal alien from Venezuela brutally murdered 22-year-old nursing student Laken Riley on the campus of University of Georgia. What makes this story all the more devastating was that the killer could have been stopped, but wasn't. So, how on earth was this tragedy even allowed to take place? Well, here's the timeline. The killer illegally entered the United States in September 22 in El Paso, Texas. He was caught, but then he was paroled into the country. He then made his way to New York City, where he was arrested for child endangerment in 2023, but then he was released. He then fled to Georgia, where he committed several petty crimes like theft and shoplifting. He was not detained by ICE. Then came the tragedy of February 22nd, where he preyed on an innocent young woman jogging around a university campus. This was allowed to take place because of the open border policies of President Biden. It took place because executive agencies are given discretion to determine what crimes trigger a detainer to be issued to take an illegal alien into custody. The discretion loophole has got to be closed. And that's why we're here today, to make sure that these tragedies never happen again. In Laken's honor, Senator Katie Britt of Alabama and I have teamed up to introduce the Laken Riley Act. This bill would require ICE to issue detainers and take into custody illegal aliens who commit crimes like theft and shoplifting. The legislation also empowers state attorneys general to sue the Secretary of Homeland Security for taking actions on immigration that harm their states or their citizens. Bottom line, if this bill were in place before February 22nd, Laken Riley would be alive today. The House of Representatives passed this bill last week in a bipartisan vote of 251 to 70, including 37 Democrats. You know, in a time of division and polarization, the Laken Riley Act, it brought both sides together. It's our hope that we can learn from this horrific situation and make some positive change. So let's pass the Laken Riley Act today. Mr. President, I'd like to yield to my colleague from Indiana.
Mr. President,
Senator from Indiana.
February 22nd, a 22-year-old nursing student named Laken Riley went for a morning run on a popular trail. Despite doing everything right, informing her friends of her expected return time, and sharing her location with them, Laken never made it home. Her life was stolen by an illegal alien who should have never been in the country. The president's open border policies are solely behind it. Remember, before he came in, we were at record lows. Now we're at record highs. We're even talking about categories we didn't have before, like gotaways. It's a national security risk. Who has come into this country when currently monthly 50 to 60,000 people never confront the Border Patrol, not to mention the 200,000 to 300,000 that do. This individual had been arrested in New York for a felony. The loss of Laken Riley was an avoidable tragedy inflicted by President Biden and his policies. These policies allow illegal aliens like Laken Riley's killer to roam free even after committing crimes. The Laken Riley Act demands the immediate deportation of illegal aliens when they are arrested for a crime. Makes sense. For those with concerns about due process, remember, we're talking about individuals with zero legal right to be in the U.S. in the first place. Retainers for ICE deportation should already be issued in these cases, but aren't in many cases due to sanctuary city status. We should honor Laken Riley's memory by assuring that no other family ever has to endure this heartache. Pass the Laken Riley Act. I yield back.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. President.
Senator from Kansas wish to be recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator from Kansas.
I want to start by thanking Senator Budd for leading this very important issue to the Senate floor. We rise today to honor and pay our respects to the late Laken Riley and her family and mourn with her family. Today we call on this chamber to come together to ensure this never happens again. Laken Hope Riley. Laken Hope Riley was a beautiful young woman in the prime of her life. Was brutally murdered in broad daylight while jogging on the University of Georgia's campus. Her alleged murderer, a Venezuelan illegal alien, was one of 2 million people paroled by Joe Biden. One of 2 million. Ironically, he was welcomed here on the United States soil by this president and his egregious open border policies. He was stopped by the United States Border Patrol in 2022 when he crossed into Kansas, into Texas illegally. But because of the Biden administration's unlawful mass parole of illegal aliens, he was permitted into our country. From Texas, he moved to New York, where he was arrested by the New York Police Department last year for acting in a manner to injure a child and for a motor vehicle violation. But he was quickly released and never turned over to ICE for deportation. Instead, he was released by police before a detainer could ever be issued by DHS and allowed to roam freely. Then he journeyed on to Athens, Georgia. And now we understand that the alleged assailant is a member of a violent Venezuelan gang. But how can we ever identify who these people are when 10,000 people are crossing our border every day? How can the Border Patrol possibly vet these people in a proper manner? Just like so many other unvetted migrants living in the country right now, this murder was handed the American dream that Laken Riley should be living right now. Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. President.
Senator from North Carolina.
It's for the reasons articulated by my friend and colleague from Kansas and friend and colleague from Indiana that, as if in legislative session, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to immediate consideration of calendar number 341, H.R. 7511. The bill be considered read a third time and passed, and that the motion to be reconsidered be considered made and laid upon the table.
Your objection.
Reserving the right to object.
The majority whip.
Mr. President, the death of Laken Riley was a horrible crime, and a heartbreaking loss. This 22-year-old American nursing student at Augusta University in Georgia, I'm certain would have made America a better place with her life and contribution to our country. But instead, she was taken from us on February 22nd, 2024. A suspect has been arrested and may ultimately be tried for this crime. That is as it should be. That is how we follow the law in the United States. But when you look at the request before us, it gives me pause. We can all agree that non-citizens who are convicted of violent crimes should be detained and removed from the United States. Sadly, the measure before us does nothing to address this issue. Under current law in the United States of America, Non-citizens who enter the country illegally, violate the terms of their status, or have their visas revoked can be detained by officials from Immigration and Customs Enforcement, better known as ICE, as they should be. Current law also requires the detention of individuals with serious criminal convictions and those who have committed murder, rape, or any crime of violence or theft offense with a term of imprisonment of at least 1 year, as they should be. The law also gives ICE the discretion to detain or release a non-citizen in any case where a non-citizen has been charged with a crime, as they should be. To make this decision, ICE must assess the individual circumstances of the case and ensure the agency's limited resources are used effectively to focus on protecting our national security and public safety, as they should be. Remember, the vast majority of Republicans, including the sponsors of this measure, recently blocked a national security supplement bill that would have given ICE more funding to detain undocumented immigrants who might pose a threat to our country. The sweeping approach in the bill before us would eliminate the agency's discretion to prioritize the most dangerous individuals and require ICE to treat those arrested for shoplifting the same as those convicted of violent crimes. Let me repeat that. Require ICE to treat those arrested for shoplifting the same as those convicted of violent crime. This would overwhelm ICE's capacity and facilities and make our nation less, not more safe. For example, this proposal before us would require ICE to detain every immigrant who's arrested for shoplifting, even if the charges are ultimately dropped and don't lead to a conviction. Remember, this bill does not require a charge or a conviction. Tell me, does it make sense to treat a non-citizen arrested for shoplifting the same as someone convicted of murder? I think we all know the answer to that question. This bill would grant, it goes into another area which hasn't been discussed much, which is hard to imagine. But this bill would grant state attorneys general the standing to sue federal immigration authorities if a state disagrees with immigration enforcement decisions made by the federal government. I think on its face, it's unconstitutional. For example, this bill would give a state attorney general the standing to challenge the use of the parole authority, for example, like Uniting for Ukraine, which allowed Ukrainians to flee Putin's war to come to the United States if the state can prove that it had an impact of $100 for the federal government to make that decision. Laken Riley's murder was a tragedy. We must do everything we can to prevent crimes like this from happening. But this legislation would make our system less safe. The reality is that most immigrants in the United States are law-abiding individuals who are seeking a better life in this country. Many studies have shown that immigrants are less likely to commit crimes than U.S. citizens. Mr. President, you know personally from your own experience in Congress, it's been more than 30 years since we have seriously considered an immigration reform bill. We had a chance, didn't we? Just a few weeks ago. There was a bipartisan group, and the White House was part of it, that wanted to sit down and change the immigration and border security laws of the United States. The Republican effort in this regard was led by James Lankford, a conservative, respected Republican from Oklahoma. On our side, Senators Murphy and Sinema negotiated for weeks, week after week, to come up with a proposal. The notion was to finally address the border security of the United States in a comprehensive, bipartisan, realistic way. It was controversial. There were some parts of it I didn't care for at all. But I thought this was a good faith bipartisan effort. We were assured that because the Republican senators had chosen Senator Lankford as their negotiator, that it at least entertained some support on the Republican side. We called the measure on the floor, and it failed because the Republicans would not join the Democrats in engaging in this bipartisan effort. The issues raised this morning by Senator Budd could have been resolved, perhaps, if we would have had that kind of bipartisan negotiation. But it didn't happen. I had my concerns about the deal, but it certainly should have moved forward. When it came to a vote, the vast majority of Republicans opposed it at the request of former President Donald Trump, who urged a no vote, who wanted the measure to stop and not be considered and move forward, and said, and I quote, "Go ahead and blame me for it." Well, I am blaming him for it, and I'm blaming those who stepped away from this bipartisan opportunity. Donald Trump has made clear that he does not want a solution to our challenges at the border. He wants an issue for the November election. And so we stepped away from the only realistic chance to have a bipartisan solution. I urge my colleagues to reject Donald Trump's advice. Let's get back to the table. Let's consider the issues being raised by the senator this morning and other issues that are important, and make a bipartisan decision to move forward to solve this problem. I object.
Objection is heard.
Mr. President.
Senator from North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. President. You know, I'm deeply disturbed in my Democrat colleagues for objecting to a bill that, had it been in place, Laken Riley's life would have been spared. The Democrat Party's commitment to open borders is causing otherwise preventable tragedies to occur again and again and again. But while we're here, let me address some of the counter-arguments that we've heard. One contention is that this bill would apply to individuals merely accused of a crime, robbing them of due process. Well, the fact that illegal aliens are freely roaming around the country in and of itself is illegal. If they then commit another crime, authorities are well within their rights to detain them. The law that this bill would strengthen already requires detention for those that have been involved in various acts such as drug trafficking, prostitution, and other vices, regardless of whether or not they've been convicted. Opponents of this bill don't just have a problem with this bill. They have a problem with well-established laws on the books. Another argument that I've heard is that this bill would violate the Constitution's standing requirements to file lawsuits. The Supreme Court in United States versus Texas provided a clear roadmap for Congress to authorize lawsuits against the executive branch for failing to enforce the law. The bill follows that roadmap and upholds the Constitution's separation of powers. The bill authorizes a state attorney general or other authorized officer to bring a lawsuit against executive branch officials for failure to enforce immigration laws in a manner that harms such state or its residents. The bill authorizes a federal court to grant appropriate injunction relief. This bill does not prejudge the result of any case or tie a judge's hands. The bill simply ensures that states are given their day in court to protect their citizens against harmful, lawless, open border policies of the Biden administration. I simply don't believe that another American family needs to experience a tragedy like the one that befell the Riley family. And I'm going to continue to work with my colleague from Alabama, Senator Britt, and all my colleagues to push this legislation until it passes this chamber. Mr. President, I yield the floor.